Nice to meet you.
Well, hello everyone, and welcome to today's COABE webinar. I'm Steve Schmidt. I'm the COABE Professional Development Coordinator, and we are so glad to be with you today for today's webinar on new research on small businesses and skills, how adult educators can use data for advocacy. We are going to play a brief video, and then after that, we will turn it over to our presenters. And just want to thank our sponsor for today's webinar, Essential Education. All right. Well, thank you all so much for being here today. And we are so thrilled to see everyone that's here for today's webinar. I would like to turn things over in just a minute to our presenters. But before I do that, once again, I want to welcome everyone. And I do want to say thanks to our sponsor, Essential Education, for their gracious support for today's webinar. Everyone attending today's webinar will receive a certificate 24 hours after the end of today's webinar. If you have not already, please introduce yourself in the chat. I know many are doing that already. And if you have questions as we go along today, please post those questions inside the Q&A. And at some point in time, either during the session or toward the end, we will get an answer to every single one of those questions. So without further ado, we will start our session on new research on small businesses and skills, how adult educators can use data for advocacy. And I am very pleased to introduce today's presenters, Amanda Bergson-Shilcock, and she is the Senior Fellow at the National Skills Coalition. And I also want to introduce the co-presenter, Jeran Culina, who is the Senior Manager of Business Leaders United, and welcome them both and really appreciative that they are presenting today. And so, Amanda, I will turn things over to you, and thank you so much for doing this presentation today.
Thanks so much, Steve, and thanks to COABE and Sharon and the whole team for inviting us to share these findings with you all today. This has been a tough year for adult education. A lot of us have spent a lot of time advocating with our state leaders and with federal officials, trying to restore funding that was delayed or cut, trying to make the case for why funding needs to be preserved in FY26. I hope that the data we're going to share with you today will help you do more of that. Again, I'm Amanda Bergson-Shilcock. I work for the nonprofit, nonpartisan National Skills Coalition. We're a big tent coalition of every affiliation you can think of, businesses, workers, community colleges, adult education providers, nonprofits, workforce development agencies, anyone with an interest in making sure that people have the skills training they need to get good jobs and support their families, and that small businesses have the workforce they need. One of our programs is our initiative is Business Leaders United, and I'm going to turn things over to my colleague Jeran Culina to talk a little bit about what we call Blue.
Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. My name's Jeran Culina, Senior Manager of our Business Leaders United Network. I like to describe it as our voice to small and mid-sized employers. We're really focusing on building awareness for those businesses and why federal programs, including adult education, are key to building the pipeline of talent that they want to see, and making sure that it mirrors the skills that they're asking for and getting the labor market demand. So they have to be better advocates also at the federal and state level. And so building awareness and making sure that they have the advocacy pieces to be able to do that work is a piece of what we do at Business Leaders United, including some of this research that we're going to talk about.
All right. And I will say, because I know folks always ask, yes, you will get copies of these slides following today's presentation, so you'll have them to refer to. And indeed, we warmly encourage you to steal our slides. Just credit Blue and National Skills Coalition, and we are happy to have you use our slides in your own materials. Okay, so our agenda today, we're going to start off with the kind of big picture takeaways for adult educators from our research. Then we're going to go into kind of why we did the study. We'll talk about what we learned, and then we'll circle back to how you can use this data in advocacy. So these are some big picture takeaways, and we'll add more detail on all of these as we go through. But the number one finding is that small businesses value foundational skills, the literacy skills, numeracy skills, and technology related skills that adult education programs teach. And they want to see more public investment in programs that teach foundational skills, both for new workers entering the workforce, but also for incumbent workers who are already on the job. That's a great finding. And that's something you should be able to brag about to any elected officials or other folks that you are putting your work in front of. We also found in our study that businesses value education and workforce partners, that's you all, adult education organizations, who put in the shoe leather to really understand their skills needs and make it easy to collaborate with them. Some of you are already doing this through integrated education and training or IET programs or other kinds of partnerships with small businesses. You might be doing an ESL class on site, but this really reaffirms the importance of that. And then finally, and this is kind of an interesting finding, we found that a subset of small businesses, of the 75 we talked to, about 20% of them have really strong hiring and skills assessment practices. And because their HR practices are really strong, they are the ones that are best positioned to be allies for adult education, right? Because they've done the pre-work of knowing what skills they're looking for. That makes them much better potential partners. Now, we're going to delve into all of these in more detail, but I wanted you to have the bottom line up front to hear some of the most important takeaways. I'm going to hand things over to Jeran now to talk about why we did the study.
Thanks, Amanda. So there's a lot that so when we looked at the approach of just understanding better about small and mid-sized companies, we were looking at how do we understand what they're looking for in the hiring process and how do skills and credentials play into that? What are the pieces that actually they're assessing? Do credentials serve as a proxy for something, whether that's education learned or the soft skills that they had to be able to uh, develop in a program, to be able to stay with a program and finish a program. So those are some of the questions that we were asking as we moved into the conversation. And then we're also looking at a really large scale conversation around people having this discussion around skills first hiring. We are seeing states move towards that, as well as larger private employers being able to understand how do they break down their job descriptions to understand what skills are necessary for entering into the jobs and not just basing everything on a 4-year degree, just to make sure that they have the education or the skills necessary to enter. So that's one of the things that we're working off of. And then also this conversation around quality non-degree credentials. What do they look like in states? How do states track those? And how do they make sure that they're defining quality in those conversations? So those are two of the main trends that we're working in at the same time. We're having these conversations around hiring. And also, as you can imagine, we're entering an uncertain economic landscape with some of the tariffs going into place, uh, large conversations about layoffs, or AI taking certain job aspects. So we weren't sure what businesses were going to be thinking as we moved into this conversation. And actually, what we found was that we had a lot of interest from employers to talk about what was happening in their hiring process. And even though these conversations we classified as anonymous and aren't publishing who were in them, they were really transparent and honest about some of the things that were happening in the space of hiring and workforce. And they really wanted to share what things they thought would be helpful in changing some of the landscape around policies that could support them in hiring the right talent. So, what were the types of businesses that we talked to? Many of the businesses were between this 200 and 600 number in size, although we had conversations with companies as small as 10 and then as large as 4,000, sometimes to just get the context of what a larger company in a certain area looks like. We really focused a lot on that small and mid-sized company, having 75 from across 40 different states, urban, suburban, exurban, and rural locations. So these were not just based here where I live in Michigan. They were all across the country in all different kinds of demographic outlooks and a lot of different political landscapes. We did focus on manufacturing and construction. I'll get into that a little bit. And on the next slide of why that was the initial focus. And then we had kind of a variety of different conversations with either owners, maybe some CHROs, largely in small companies. They were HR that were doing a lot of different jobs. That could be accounting, finance, hiring. So these people had a wide array of objectives that they were trying to meet, but they were largely the higher level people in the company doing HR practices. And then we really focused on manufacturing and construction because, as you all know, there's a widespread presence of those industries across the country. And they were all at the time and definitely both prior and still now hiring at steady approaches. And they were having those issues with what does it look like to hire individuals, and whether that was following degree programs or credential programs, or like really just looking at skills. And then we knew that in this conversation, we're also thinking that we really wanted to see that middle ground of credentials in the use of credentials in the hiring process. We didn't want to go too far into the healthcare industry where things were regulated by licensing requirements. And we really wanted to see more than just a few credentials that maybe outlie what these businesses are looking for. So I think I'm passing over to you, Amanda.
I think actually you've got the
Just kidding.
next few slides and then you're passing it to me.
Oh, so we're really looking into two categories of what this means for what we learned. And I really think that Amanda said the ground perfectly when she talked about us really focusing on the adult education conversation, how it really, how these findings can be important for people in the field. Um, The first finding is what businesses want policymakers to do to support skills. So we asked in these conversations really what could be helpful for them when they're working towards hiring this more diverse talent pipeline than maybe they've ever had to do before. And one of the most important things was around increased funding. There needed to be more funding available for getting the right skills for these individuals, and there needed to be more conversations around incumbent worker training. How do we move people up in companies? How do we hire the right talent so that they've been invested in like community college, workforce boards, adult education sphere, and then how do we continue to move them up in career pathways? And then the second part of that is there were, as Amanda said, a number of businesses that were working towards best practices in hiring and skills assessment. And we talked about, they brought up this conversation around what an employer of choice really means and being an employer of choice for the community. And the takeaway from that is that adult educators can use these findings to inform their own outreach and program design and thinking through how do they articulate skills and what those skills mean, and then how do those move on a career pathway as well.
Okay, so I'm going to take us through the next part of the findings here, and that's to go deeper on that first set of findings of what businesses want state leaders to do. And as Jeran said, we got some very candid and frank advice from the folks that we talked to. The first finding I previewed already when I talked about the bottom line up front, right? Businesses want state departments of education and state departments of labor to expand their support for foundational skills, particularly math, English, and digital or technology related skills. So the takeaway for adult educators here is, we talk often about the impact of adult education on learners, and that is critically important, and we should never stop talking about that. But it's also valuable to be able to talk about the importance of this work for small businesses. And I think, there's a lot of mechanisms for large businesses to make their voices heard to policymakers, right? They can belong to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. They can pay for a lobbyist if they're big enough. Even if they're not that big, if they're hiring 100 workers a year, they can march down the street to their local community college and get a custom training program designed just for them. They can have time to sit on a workforce board and weigh in. But small businesses don't have that capacity, right? And so this study is really their voice, and it's your opportunity to channel the voices of small businesses when you talk to elected officials. The second major finding is that a lot of small businesses we talked to were really interested in upskilling their frontline workers so that they could be promoted, right? And some of you are, again, already doing this as incumbent worker training programs or in your IET programs, your integrated education and training programs. But we heard over and over again, well, Joe is really good at the technical stuff, but when I tried to promote him as a supervisor, it became clear that he lacks some, written and spoken communication skills and some other skills that we really need our supervisors to have, right? That's exactly what we do in adult education, right? We support the development of those literacy skills, those communication skills in English. So again, this is something you can use as part of your argument with policymakers and also with other audiences. A lot of employers also talk to us about how important it was for new workers to have had some kind of hands-on experience. So they didn't just want workers who had had book learning, right? Um, the they wanted folks who had hands-on experience. And so if your organization is offering a pre-apprenticeship program, an IET, or some other kind of work-based learning as part of your adult education offerings, This is a really powerful finding to be able to point to that, book learning is one piece of the puzzle, but it's not the only piece of the puzzle. And employers really value programs that allow learners and workers to be able to get some real world experience. We also heard, and I'm going to talk about this more a little bit later on, small businesses are really overwhelmed by the different kinds of credentials that they see showing up on people's resumes, right? I'm talking about things that are not a 2-year or a 4-year degree, a certificate, a certification, a badge, a this, a that. They are really, in many cases, puzzled by them and don't know what to make of them. Sometimes they sort of throw up their hands and disregard them. Sometimes they say, well, if we know the training program provider, then we can trust their credential. But otherwise, if we don't know the organization, then I just ignore the credential. And sometimes, some employers told us, well, we view really any credential as kind of a rough proxy for somebody who has persistence and perseverance and can stick with something. But other than that, we don't really pay that much attention, right? And this is for entry-level roles. They paid a lot more attention to credentials as you got to the second level, that is promoting people. But again, thinking about how we communicate the value of credentials that learners might earn through your program. Maybe you're doing North Star digital literacy. Maybe you're doing some other type of short-term credential. Maybe you do have a food safety training that you're doing with adult learners through an IET in the culinary area. Whatever it is, make sure that you're giving your learners the tools to explain that certification with a line or two on their resume and then in person in a job interview. Otherwise, you're going to find that that certification or that credential that your learners work so hard to get is just not going to be registering with small businesses. We also heard that a lot of businesses were frustrated by how challenging it was for them to access available funding, particularly for incumbent worker training, but also for other partnerships. And so here, again, if your organization already has some successful small business partnerships, that might be something that you could use as a lever to push your state agency to sort of highlight your organization as a strong case study and an example for other employers to learn or benefit from. And then finally, small businesses were very blunt that they often feel like state agencies and other um, key partners just don't have enough staff capacity to be able to work with smaller businesses. They're set up to work with big businesses that have 5,000 employees or more, and they're just not well set up for a 40-person company. But those 40-person companies, we know that's where a lot of our adult learners are working. That's where a lot of our adult learners are going to get their foot in the door for their first job. So, thinking about, and this might not be reality for all of you, but does your organization have the ability to help your state agency build out some of that capacity in connecting with smaller businesses? So I'm going to pause here. That was one set of findings about what businesses want policymakers to do. Jeran is now going to talk about our second set of findings. And this is what she previewed for you in that category of kind of findings number 2, which is, okay, those are the things they want policymakers to do. What do we know about how small businesses are handling their hiring and skills assessment? And how can that help us as adult educators to help our learners? So Jeran, let me turn this over to you for this section.
Yeah. So, as we move through in the hiring and skills assessment conversation, we learned a lot again because of the transparent nature of those individuals to be able to share a little bit more about what it looks like for them to hire, especially maybe a little bit more on these companies that HR functions as all different capacities. So we, as you can imagine, found out that their companies are really differing on how they actually work through the hiring process. And many of them are doing good work, but it's kind of still work in progress because they're working towards implementing things like breaking down job descriptions or kind of getting those career pathways. developed so that people know what the next step in their journey is. So we know that there's going to be varying degrees of where businesses are on that level. And because of that, adult educators really need to consider what kind of capacity businesses have to be able to do this work. Um, we learned a lot about how technical assistance is really helpful for these businesses and thinking through how do they break down the skills that they have, and then how do they continue to move forward with this kind of movement towards turnover as well. And there and then we really found these group of individuals that are working what they called themselves as employers of choice, who had adopted this really strong, cohesive set of strong of hiring practices that started really from them understanding what the cost of turnover was for their company, and then made them backtrack and thinking like, how do we continue to retain good staff so that we're not continually having to worry about this turnover conversation. Um, so the big and this is something that's important to be remembering as you have conversations with employers, is that they weren't having conversations around what job quality and good jobs or worker voice. Like maybe some of the things that we're saying in conversations, they didn't use those words. But like I said, they really wanted to be the employers of choice in their community. They wanted people to look at them as somewhere that they wanted to work, because it was just a good job for them. And that really gave them this advantage of being able to both recruit and retain staff on a different degree than some of the other companies that were in their same area. And what did that mean for them? It really meant that it wasn't just about having job descriptions that laid out what people needed to know. It was well defined in the fact that they were matching what actual needs they had to the job. So, or what actual skills they needed for each job that they had. This meant that they were going through and understanding like, how does this align with the mission of the organization? And then how do we make sure that these jobs are aligned with a career pathway so that people aren't just gaining skills and then staying in the same place, but they're moving up in the positions as well. They also had very strong relationships with education and workforce partners. That might have just been one partner that they worked with, but they were working in tandem of being able to communicate what was working effectively for them, what wasn't working for them, and they were continually dialoguing about how they made changes to the credential process, to the curriculum process, so that it aligned with the changing skills that were happening in these companies. Because imagine we're talking about manufacturers moving from industry 4.0 to industry 5.0, and really seeing this need for more digital skills. So how do we add those kind of things into these conversations around education and workforce systems? There was also this conversation of how people worked in tandem with other companies, and not just in maybe some superficial ways of going to meetings at their chamber locations or through their SHRM groups, but how are they really collaborating with other industry peers that were also leading in being employers of choice, so they could understand like, what things did you put in place? How could I put those things in place? And really having conversations that were deeper than just passing by each other in workforce settings. Um, and one thing that really stands out in the conversation that we had, and I'm sure you have with employers, is that soft skills continues to come up as something that is very important for individuals, especially in the hiring process, because they wanted people that could um, really fit into the culture of the organization and the business. And we found that was important to these employers of choice, because they weren't just saying like, you should have these soft skills. They were actually connecting it to the mission, and the values of the company in a way that every piece of skill that were in the job description were connected to the mission of the organization. So that was really important, that they weren't just saying like, you have to be a compliant to the rules of the place, but that we wanted you to fit into this culture, and a piece of that is having the right soft skills to be able to do that, of teamwork and collaboration. Um, and then we talked about that employers didn't say the word worker voice, but they often talked about things that we saw as being pieces of worker voice because they were putting in these feedback loops for individuals to be able to say, if I have a challenge at work, whether that's like shift time, whether that's supervisor, whether that's just processes that exist within the company, I have a way that I can talk. I can share those concerns, and those concerns will actually either be solved or we'll have conversations with you on what the next steps for that is. It's not just laying somewhere in a employee complaint area. They're actually fixing those things that exist that workers are having challenges with. So everybody's being able to feel comfortable raising those concerns. And then a really important thing is that people had the ability to not just be workers in their lives at these places. They were also people outside of those lives as workers. And so that meant that the the HR folks or the owner were working with the workers when they had challenges outside of the work time. I know we like to utilize this example of a business that had a lot of folks that had a lot of women in their workforce, and one of the things that they faced was that they were coming late to their shift every day at work. And when the owner asked a lot of questions, they found out that what it was that there was school drop off time, and we all know if you have kids that line takes forever to get through. And so just shifting the manufacturing shift time 30 minutes allowed them to have everybody on time for that. So just being able to ask questions of what was happening in the workers' lives and fixing some of those solutions, whether that was through their own means or through working with nonprofits to be able to get to the challenges that occur with childcare and transportation. And that really means those are things that you can learn as adult educators about some of the findings that we identify here, because they really help with thinking through what are the best small businesses to be able to work with, because they are really thinking through this process of, okay, turnover is really impacting me and my bottom line. And so I know that investing in workforce and retention solutions are important. And I would want to be partnering with an education and workforce partner that's really working with me to make sure that I get the right skills and the right talent in the door. And those are really what the people that you want to be facing when you're looking at what small businesses could support you in the adult education process.
Awesome. Thanks, Jeran. And I hope all of you found those findings helpful in sort of thinking through, okay, we have very limited time in our day as adult educators. We can only afford to reach out to probably a handful of small businesses. How do we prioritize which ones to reach out to? And the answer to that is whether they have their act together on some of those variables that Jeran just listed. So I promised that I would go a little deeper on credentials. So I'm going to do that. We have about maybe 7 more minutes of presentation here, and then we have a good 20 minutes or so set aside for Q&A. So please be thinking of your questions now. Drop them in the Q&A box so that Jeran and I can make sure to answer anything that you're wondering about, or if there's something you're really proud of and want to brag about your program, we'd love to hear that too. So one of our major findings, and I said this earlier, is that there's a big gap between how educators talk about short-term credentials and how small businesses understand them. Whether that is a ServSafe certification for food service workers, whether that is, a short-term certificate or certification or a badge, or, we could go on and on of all the different kinds of credentials out there. So really thinking not just about like how many credit hours something's worth if you're on the community college side of adult ed, or excuse me, whether something is on the TABE test or the CASAS, or whether someone, can show a EFL learning gain. How do you communicate the value of credentials to your learners in ways that when they are looking for a job or trying to talk to their boss about why they should get promoted, that they can communicate? And I'm not talking about some massive, overwhelming task for yourself. I'm talking about thinking about maybe one sentence to describe what a credential is that you can almost think of in a marketing technique, right? If your GED students are trying to decide whether to enroll in your IET program and you're talking to them about an industry recognized credential they're going to earn in that program, you want to have that one sentence description of here's why a business would care that you've earned this credential, right? And that seems really basic and really elementary, but Jeran and I talked to 75 small businesses, and a lot of them are not getting that kind of one sentence explanation of credentials. And so they're just tuning out that information. And that is really bad news for our learners. We also heard that businesses that had a strong relationship with an education or workforce partner, which might have been a K-12 school, it might have been an adult ed program, it might have been a community college, it might have been a nonprofit organization, whatever it was, if they had a relationship with the educational partner, they were more likely to trust the credentials that the person had earned at that organization. So that's commonsensical. I hope you're all nodding along with me and going, yeah, that makes sense. But it really does emphasize that if you want there to be a good feedback loop between your learners who come to you saying, one of the reasons I'm enrolling in adult education is I want to get a job or I want to get a better job, and your funders who are saying, I want to see employment outcomes for your learners, and your board of directors or others who may be saying, how does your work connect to businesses in our community, or how do you support economic vitality? You want to be having those relationships with businesses so that they recognize you as a provider and recognize the credentials that you're helping people earn. So bottom line, small businesses hear plenty about credentials, but a lot of what they hear doesn't really make sense to them. So when we talk about using all of this data that Jeran and I have just shared with you in advocacy, there's a couple big picture things that I hope you will take with you as we go into the last part of this conversation together today. The first is you already know a lot about adult learning theory and andragogy, right? We know how adults learn best. And guess what? Elected officials and their staff members and your local newspaper or public radio station and your board of directors, they are also adult learners. And you need to be thinking just as rigorously about how you present outcome or uh, advocacy information to them as you do about how to present your curriculum to your learners. So you already have the tools you need to be able to make the case effectively, but oftentimes there's a bit of a disconnect, and we've all seen it, right? Where people do a really passionate presentation around advocacy, but they don't connect it to the policymaker's real world experience. And so the policymaker can't really make sense of it or doesn't really absorb it. It sort of bounces off of them. We know how to do this in the classroom. We know how to do it with adult learners. Remember that your policymakers and your local media and your board of directors and your funders, they are adult learners too. And we don't always explicitly think of them that way. That means connecting the dots, right? To really help policymakers see, okay, if what you care about is small business vitality, I got news for you. Your small business can't hire qualified workers unless we, as an adult education provider, have the funding and the resources we need to help people upskill and prepare for these jobs, right? In terms of local media, many of you already have strong relationships with your media, but if you haven't, if you still have a local newspaper, reaching out to their editorial board and asking if you can come to an editorial board meeting and talk about adult education issues in your community. Reaching out to your local public radio station if you still have one, or to other local journalists to really show what you're doing. And again, journalists are adult learners too. So use your adult learning theory hat, use your andragogy hat, use your thinking about thinking, right? Your metacognition knowledge to help um, position the information you want to share with folks in ways that they can absorb it, right? And then, of course, your own board. You might think, but our board knows what we do. They came to our graduation. They know how great our students and learners are. They do, but that doesn't mean they know how to talk about it. And that doesn't mean they know how to talk about it with relationship to small business in particular. So one of my big goals today is that in hearing about these findings from Jeran and from me, you're going there thinking with what I jokingly sometimes call popcorn thoughts in your head, which is, oh, now I have an idea for how our next presentation at our board meeting can, kind of give folks a one pager, or, oh, now I have a sense of how I can talk about our IET program in a different way, right? Um, this is a key audience to help get your message out. They already love your organization. They're already on your board. They should be able to talk about the business connection to adult education. So we have a full report, and I will be dropping the link to that in the chat in a minute. We also have a two-page summary, which, full disclosure, was mostly designed for federal officials, and frankly, mostly designed for workforce advocacy. It is not an adult ed only focused document, but it does mention the importance of foundational skills as our third recommendation. So it is included. Um, so I warmly encourage you to check out the full report, to share the two-pager. And again, you're going to get these slides after our conversation today. Please steal our slides, use them in your own presentations, use them to help make the case. We're going to move into the Q&A now, and I'm going to stop sharing the slides in a second, but just so you know, the very last slide you'll get when you get this presentation has the contact information for Jeran and for me. And we warmly encourage you to reach out to us if you have something cool you want to share about what your organization is doing, if you want us to do a virtual briefing for your local Chamber of Commerce or for some other business and adult education collaboration that you have going on, we would be delighted to do it. So we're going to open things up to questions now. And like I said, I'm also going to drop into the chat the landing page for our new report, which has links to both the full report and the two-pager. And then just for fun, I am going to just actually drop the direct link to the two-pager into the chat here. So this is a great time. If you want us to clarify anything, please drop that into the chat or into the Q&A. Or if you want to brag about something cool that your organization is doing, or if you had a question that you thought this presentation would answer, but we haven't gotten to, that's a great one. Okay, so I see our first question coming up from Dinesh. Thank you, Dinesh. What advocacy or involvement is there with local public school districts, and how do they fit into the puzzle? I'm going to let Jeran have the first crack at answering this, because before she came to National Skills Coalition, she did a lot of work in career technical education, which of course crosses over between K-12 education and community colleges. So I'll let Jeran weigh in, and then I will chime in with some additional thoughts. Jeran?
Yeah, that's a great question too. And I have got it several times in some of this presenting from local superintendents, just about the landscape of that it's constantly changing and being unsure of what businesses actually need versus what the labor market is telling them. And so a piece of that for me is just making sure that especially making sure that CTE is a part of the system of workforce, making sure that K-12 is part of the system of workforce so that it's not because we're talking about the capacity of businesses, they're also talking about the fact that they don't have time to just be separately talking to each entity to talk about like what the skills they need are, what the degrees they need are, what are their certificates. So making sure if there's any way that they can sit on the whatever it is, sit on the workforce board, sit in the board meetings, be able to create or have just standing conversations with the K-12 system. I think that's really important because a lot of the conversations we had with employers recognize the fact that students aren't aware of a lot of jobs that exist in this landscape of manufacturing and construction. So often they're missing out on these like little bit niche careers or even just like careers that exist within manufacturing and construction, like finance and accounting, like social media, all of the things that are a part of any business that they miss out on. So I think it's just the creation of more spaces where K-12 in workforce and higher ed are all together with business, and whether that's industry sector partnerships or not, maybe it's just a chamber that convenes everybody. I think that's an important piece of the puzzle.
Thanks, Jeran. And just I would add a couple quick things. Some of you may be working for adult education organizations that are actually located within. Um, oh my goodness, I'm seeing that the earlier chat message didn't go to the right person. I will fix that. Um, some of you are already working within K-12 systems, right? You're running community education programs and you are okay, so I've just dropped a couple of links into the chat here. So you might already have those relationships. And I wrote about one example in El Paso a few years back, and I'm putting that in here in terms of the example from El Paso. So El Paso example. So in this case, the adult education program is called Community Education, and they are an AFLA funded or WIOA Title II funded program. And they were paying the high school CTE teachers to work overtime in the evening to work with adult learners in integrated education and training programs. And because of that, the school district was much more aware of and a partner around adult ed than they might otherwise have been. If your adult ed program is housed in a nonprofit or a community college and you're not connected directly to your K-12 system, making those connections can be really valuable. Couple things. I'm seeing a comment in the chat that I want to briefly respond to, and then we have another question from Tammy that I want to make sure we get to. Nancy is flagging the efforts by the administration around dismantling the Department of Education and putting it in the Department of Labor. Our CEO at National Skills Coalition has done a social media post with our response to that. We are extremely concerned about this, and we do not support this kind of action that really doesn't reflect what we know from students and learners and people who work within the system to be a thoughtful way to approach federal policy. So I'll link to that LinkedIn post in a little bit. Okay.
Oh, and one thing on that,
Yeah.
Amanda, to the business side of what that looks like is I also send out an email to the business community on awareness about it and how that impacts the businesses. Because sometimes they may see that Department of Labor, Department of Ed announcement and say like, okay, well, that doesn't concern me. So I try to make sure that when we have these things that are happening at the administration level, that we're also connecting it to the business and how that impacts their workforce. So just know that that's also happening in the national skills sphere of things. And if there are concerns that you have that aren't being uplifted, that or you think that businesses should be aware of, please also let me know that information as well. And it may be just something that I need to put on the radar of all of these businesses that we work with.
Yeah. Okay, so then we have a question from Tammy. Do you have an FAQ of micro credentials or credentials language for resume feedback from your business interactions? We have not drafted that. We do not have that. What I would be happy to think about is whether we might do a short slideshow with some takeaways from our research. Realistically, if we do that, it would probably be out in January. We just had a meeting this morning about all kinds of ancillary blog posts and case studies and other follow-ups that we might do from this research. I think it's probably within scope for us to do a little slideshow of some language that might be helpful. And so I'm going to take this suggestion back and add it to our working list. Jeran, anything you want to add on that front before we go on to the next one? Okay. So another question from Dinesh around municipalities struggling with local and regional economies that might lack industry, or might have negative trends in terms of hiring. What can be done when local organic industry is limited and opportunities are dwindling, when there's less opportunities and more job seekers? So I think there's a few parts of answer to this question. The first is, have you talked to your adult learners about where they are working, right? What have you talked to? What do you know about where they are working? Are they doing gig work like DoorDash or Instacart? Are they doing private duty home care that might be off the books, right? Where are they finding employment? I'm not saying that where they're finding employment is always the best and you should be designing for that, but talking to them about where they are finding employment is helpful for you in understanding what's still going on, right? In a lot of communities for a long time, the answer to that has been healthcare. Now with the Medicaid cuts, there's a lot of uncertainty around that. So I understand we're in a place with a lot of moving targets, and it can be challenging. Um, the other thing I think to think about is, if there aren't a lot of businesses, there are other people having other conversations a little outside the box. And one is, for example, a nonprofit called the Democracy at Work Collaborative. DAWI, D-A, Democracy at Work Initiative, sorry, DAWI. And I'm going to put a link to their website in the chat here, Democracy at Work Initiative. And they help set up worker co-ops, right? And so you might have adult learners who are in 1099 independent contractor jobs, right? They are not in W-2 payroll jobs. But they are working as a house cleaner, or they are working as a home health aide, or they are, working in some other job where they are in a 1099 job. Maybe they're graphic designers, right? Oh yeah, thank you, Dinesh, for putting that in the chat, and I've just added it. Perhaps this can be particularly valuable for some immigrants who might be working as 1099 independent contractors. So it's not a silver bullet. It doesn't fix everything. But I think when folks are working in communities that are struggling economically, it can be valuable to think outside the box of, well, maybe folks aren't always going to be employed in traditional employment. So let's think about what could good look like in the other cases, right? We don't want people to be in low quality jobs that exploit them or don't pay them well. But that is one initiative. And the woman at the Democracy at Work Initiative is Antu Win, and I'm going to put her name in the chat here. And Antu is just terrific. She's done some really interesting work. Jeran, was there anything you wanted to add on that question?
So the one thing I would say is the employer, there were a few employers of choice that had mapped transferability of skills from one industry to another industry. And so the more that folks can see how their skills move across industries, maybe they were planning on going to the manufacturing field. I am a SUNY Buffalo grad, so I understand the Western New York landscape. My first job was in the Perry Project, so I too do understand what it looks like in Western New York. And the changing landscape of manufacturing to new things. So just one, as layoffs occur, how can adults better understand how their skills move to other, but also having businesses better understand how other industry skills can transfer into what they want. Especially, we saw that a lot in COVID, where there was a lot of movement in between industry to industry. Sometimes retail moving into healthcare. So just the ability for both sides, both workers to understand their skills and how they move, and then businesses to understand how other industries can move into theirs.
Awesome. Okay. And then I want to ask Dinesh to elaborate on their last question, which I'm not sure I'm fully following. The question is, what can be done with sincere community partnership and a lack of accountability by regulatory bodies and funders? I'm not sure what regulatory bodies you're thinking of. If you can add a little more to your question, I think we might be able to be better at answering it. Um, So I'll give you a moment to do that in the chat. If anyone else has questions, we have just a couple more minutes, and Jeran and I are happy to take additional questions. Let's see. I see Lisa's question, would the Democracy at Work site help with this if a person with a CNA certificate is working in private home care with several clients, but working for themselves, not as an organization? This affects recertification, how to get recertified since they are not working with an agency. Lisa, this is a state by state issue, and unfortunately, I don't have an answer for you off the top of my head for all 50 states. You could certainly ask Dowie and see if they could help. Another set of folks you could reach out to are the folks at World Education Services, or WES. You may already be in contact with WES, but they've been doing a lot around home health and healthcare work generally. So if you're not already in touch with Wes, yeah, I would encourage you to reach out to them. Okay, so I'm seeing the follow-up. If partners in the community are not sincerely doing their part, how can one go about encouraging the necessary participation to move the needle? There's two answers to that question. One is focus on the people who do have energy and build your work there, and go around the people who aren't doing what they need to be doing. And that's easier said than done. And I realize some of you may be saying, but those people are the bottleneck, they're the roadblock, they're why I can't do anything. And honestly, sometimes that is true. I don't want to paper over things. But oftentimes, those people might be the bottleneck until you get someone who does have energy, right? So I just went into St. Louis to do a presentation around early childhood workers and apprenticeship. This is a great program. It's going really well. They've got a great number of partners in St. Louis. One of the reasons I was there is that it's hard to be a prophet in your own hometown. And so having a strange lady from Washington, D.C. come and talk at their event was part of their effort to bring in other partners to say, oh, this is getting national attention. This is a bandwagon we should jump on, right? Like, let us jump on this bandwagon. So one question is like, who does have energy, even if those people are not in positions of power? And can you start with those people who have energy? And come up with ways to work around the people who might have power, who might be a bottleneck. The second is, can you draw attention to what you're doing in a way that can get the folks who are the roadblock or the bottleneck to say, oh, even if we don't want to put time and energy into this, we at least don't want to stand in the way of it. Right. And so getting a newspaper article featured or something like that. When I worked at a community-based nonprofit, I had a funder once, and I was trying to talk to them about West African immigrants in West Philadelphia. And I had a long conversation with them, and they were sort of like, uh-huh, uh-huh, uh-huh. And then a couple weeks later, a newspaper reporter called me, and he said he was thinking about doing some stories, and did I have any suggestions for him on stories? And so we went back and forth, and eventually he did a story on West African immigrants in West Philadelphia. And the funder called me and was like, did you see this article in the newspaper? And I was like, oh my God, I was quoted in the article, right? Like, yes, of course I saw the article, right? But it was only when the funder saw something in the newspaper that she thought something was real, right? And so to her, it wasn't real when I was telling her about it. It was real when she read about it in the newspaper, even though I was the source for the newspaper article, right? And so sometimes you just have to come up with your creative strategies. Jeran, I'm going to give you a minute to add any last thoughts you have, and we're going to turn things over to Steve to close us out.
I mean, I'll always say we all know how powerful businesses are. So, how can you leverage the strength of businesses that lie in the communities where those individuals are maybe being a little bit tougher in it? So, whether we think a smaller businesses has that power or leverage, I have seen it so many times in my own community of Grand Rapids, Michigan, of some of these employers coming back and supporting some of these things. So if you have true champions in some of your board or other places that are business leaders, please use them to the advantage of getting people to be pushed in the right direction, in whatever language they want to utilize to be able to do that too.
All right, Steve, back over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Amanda, and thank you, Jeran, for your wonderful presentation today and the robust Q&A. Amanda and Jeran, would you mind just putting your contact information real quick in the chat because it may be a little bit
Absolutely.
before the slides are available. And by attending today's webinar, the recording will be available 24 hours from now, and you will be receiving a certificate as well. But our grateful thanks go to both Amanda and Jeran for their time today. Some really great actionable information that was given, and very thankful to you both for your presence today. And thank you, everyone, for attending. And we will look forward to seeing you at a future COABE webinar. And thank you all again for being here today. And let's see, we're getting close to the holiday season. So wish everyone a wonderful Thanksgiving next week and hopefully a few days off. And we'll be looking forward to seeing you very soon on the next COABE webinar. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.